the part of Red Canary that I think, if I had to pick, and I've had a lot of jobs here over the years, but if I had to pick my favorite one, it would be working in threat hunting and just going to figure out like how do we cover down on things that um, we haven't or can't perfectly mechanize, right? Where you can't just like emit a signal to an analyst and say this is probably bad because, and there's a whole bunch of reasons like why you can't do that. Um, in some cases, obviously, like emerging intelligence, or we learn something and we need to look back. In some cases, I think like the examples we'll go through today, dealing with things like identity, where it's like far less deterministic and not subject to the laws of physics in the same way that like Mac OS, Windows, Linux are. I want to welcome two folks today. We got Brittany and Tyler. So we're going to jump right in. We've got a pretty neat topic today. This is one based on like your requests from the audience in the past, and I'd say also some of the feedback we've got. We kind of been taking a look at what you've told us you enjoy, don't enjoy, and where we think we've kind of like hit or missed the mark in past episodes. And one of the things that has been really consistent is that everyone wanted more time for Q&A. So we're going to skip the news this week because I want to make sure to give Tyler and Brittany plenty of time, but also give like y'all here in the chat, the audience, plenty of time to ask questions like as we're going through the material. I'll also kind of take a peek at any questions you submitted on the way in. So without further ado, Tyler, Brittany, would y'all like to just let everyone know who you are, what you do? Brittany, you first.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to talk to everybody about threat hunting. I'm a threat hunter here at Red Canary and I've been here for about 2 years, but I've been doing threat hunting for the last 6. Tyler, if you want to share.
Yeah, I've been here also about 2 years and been doing threat hunting, security operations, SOC type work for probably the last, also I guess 6 or 8 years as well.
Sweet. All right. Well, yeah, I think it's I feel like anything over like 5 years is like at least one full lifetime in this
That's just
industry.
like blurred. I don't know. Like
It's
I've been
commendable.
doing it, I don't know how long.
Well, all right. So today we're going to talk through, for those of you who don't have context. So like one of the things that I think we've always done really uniquely at Red Canary is have obviously like an incredible scale detection engineering, like intelligence operations, kind of like I'd say like mechanical threat detection component. But the part of Red Canary that I think, if I had to pick, and I've had a lot of jobs here over the years, but if I had to pick my favorite one, it would be working in threat hunting and just going to figure out like how do we cover down on things that we haven't or can't perfectly mechanize, right? Where you can't just like emit a signal to an analyst and say this is probably bad because, and there's a whole bunch of reasons like why you can't do that. Um, in some cases, obviously, like emerging intelligence, or we learn something and we need to look back. In some cases, I think like the examples we'll go through today, dealing with things like identity, where it's like far less deterministic and not subject to the laws of physics in the same way that like Mac OS, Windows, Linux are. So I'm going to turn it over, kind of let them walk through this. But I think that kind of concept of like how do we take, baselining for normal behavior, determine what's anomalous, and then figure out how to do that like at scale when we're dealing with kind of a combination of like having to look across 1,000+ organizations, right? So like unlike being a threat hunter for, Contoso Corporation, like, this team doesn't have the benefit of like learning the ins and outs of every one of 1,000+ companies, but we still do have to figure out how to do this like well and quickly and with confidence. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over. So like Tyler, I'll kind of let you like lead us into this. I think you all prepared like what I think is like a neat kind of case study or example here. So like what are we looking at, and how do we want to start talking through this today?
Yeah, for sure. So this is in the realm of identity, which has been as Keith said, a pretty hot topic with baselining and trying to figure out how we hunt and detect things where we're just fundamentally a little less deterministic than we are on endpoint. And so what we've got here are 2 login events shown side by side for 2 different users. And the question at the top of the slide is, are we able to tell from just this information whether or not either of these is normal or anomalous activity? excuse me. And I think with identity, we can look at some of the target applications. We might be able to look at some of the IP addresses or geolocations, but it's a little different, in my opinion, than looking at an endpoint and seeing like Mimikatz go Bert, right? Like it's not quite the same approach. And so we picked these two because they're a good example of kind of the challenge that we face with identity. And so they both succeeded. They have different target applications, different geolocations. They're looking at two different clients. So yeah, we can go over to the next slide where we will show the answer.
Yeah. So for those examples, definitely hard to tell without context, as Tyler was saying. But really, the anomalous one was this one for bah humbug, and the reason why was because in a short amount of time, there was events from multiple hosting providers, like sign-in attempts and other activity for the identity, which helped us make that determination of, hey, this is odd. This user doesn't usually exhibit this behavior. And also a lot of times, this hosting infrastructure is used for like adversary-in-the-middle type attacks or phishing. So I'll let Tyler go to the next slide and share a little bit more about kind of what led us to this and more of the hunt hypothesis that helped us kind of find this behavior.
Yeah. And one thing to emphasize with baselining, and of course it's kind of built into it, is like, if you just look at those login events as isolated events or atomic indicators, it's really hard to tell, right? And a key part of a lot of this stuff is you're going to have to be able to collect and analyze data over time, and there's a lot of challenges associated with that. But so for this particular one, the hunt hypothesis was that we suspected that identities compromised via adversary-in-the-middle phishing may authenticate from two new distinct data centers within a defined time frame. So in this case, we were looking at a 48-hour window, which likely represents what we've seen and what we hypothesized was that one data center was from the web server the phishing kit is hosted on, and then the operator actually authenticating from a different data center via commercial proxy. And so we gave ourselves a 48-hour window to kind of bucket and try to capture that behavior. So in this case, we're not looking at a single logon event, but are there multiple events that line up with this? So we're not just looking at somebody authenticating from New Jersey. In this case, it might be somebody authenticating in 48 hours. They've never authenticated from New Jersey before, and then prior to that, they authenticated from ZenLayer or some other anomalous data center.
There's a good question. So Andres just asked a question in the chat, and I think this is probably a great lead in. I think you're going to walk through this, but I know anybody who's dealt with like Entra ID, Okta, anything like that, you get like these kind of deluge of the dreaded impossible travel alerts. And so I think you've got some kind of context here. I think that's like equal parts specific to the data sources, but also like you maybe draw the distinction between like what we're looking for and then something like impossible travel. If there's a distinction at all, which like maybe a good open question for you.
Yeah, I think in this case, as the slide says, we've got some contributing intelligence that kind of scopes it down. You're exactly right. Like the impossible travel stuff shows up a ton, and as much as we would like to say like just use only authorized VPNs, and then detect if you can get away with that. Like yes, like know what VPNs are authorized to be used, know what the expected traffic is, know what you're supposed to see coming in there. And then if you see, if you're only using, I don't know, like Global Protect or some other VPN or some other consumer grade VPN, NordVPN, what have you, and you see, Proton VPN, right? That's an automatic signal. But if you don't have that luxury, which a lot of folks don't due to, just lack of control, BYOD, we're really looking at a little more activity we try to look at a little more activity rather than, two authentications coming from different locations. And so in this case, we did have some contributing intelligence that we used to identify like known abused data centers. So we kind of had to make some assumptions based off of intelligence to help scope that down. But once we're kind of able to make that assumption and work through that hypothesis, it allowed us to filter out what we weren't looking for. Not that that information perhaps isn't valuable or isn't relevant, but it just wasn't specific to the hypothesis here. I don't know, Brittany, if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think in this case, like you said, it was really focused, and sometimes going in it from a hunting perspective, having it kind of defined what you're looking for helps. From those like impossible travel alerts, I think it's a lot of environments I've been in, they've always been a challenge just because you have people traveling and VPN usage and just being able to align on what's accepted in an environment can be very challenging from some organizations because like different vendors, or if you're a university or something, a lot of users will have VPNs. Um, so another thing we'll probably touch on a little bit later in the slide is also having just the baselining or context about your organization that helps you kind of filter out those events that are more anomalous and learn where to focus. Like this one, we use, the intel to focus on ones that we have seen with adversary in the middle, or kind of just more hosting providers that are a little more suspicious, not necessarily an indicator on their own, but enough of a like suspicious activity along with other contexts to make that determination.
So yeah, I think I appreciate that. Thank you both for kind of breaking that down, because I was admittedly like not sure how to answer like Andre's question, but I think that is maybe it sounds like the big takeaway or the distinction there is that we are definitely talking about, in this case, something different or really distinct from impossible travel, and that this is really like when you say like hypothesis led, right? This is really focused on a pretty specific hypothesis that like may also overlap with an impossible travel alert, for example, but in this case was not what you were hunting for, right? You were not hunting for
Right.
like geographic disparity over time. It's more of like ASN and kind of attribution to like a data center or an org, something like that. Awesome. Cool. All right. So now like, yeah, talk us through like, this is just, I think folks who have read anything we've put out, like we always try to like, pseudocode kind of either like detection analytics, but in this case, I think it's the first time we've kind of talked through pseudocode for like a hunt hypothesis or methodology. So like take us through this briefly.
Yeah, so we've got two approaches here. We sometimes when we're hunting, we like to try to maybe have a couple different approaches to tackle a hypothesis. It's not always one for one, right? So there's multiple ways to perhaps get better coverage of that hypothesis or disprove it, prove it, have you. So the first approach here, as it says, it's authentication from multiple unique data centers. And what that pseudocode is basically saying is, again, looking at an organization in those lists of anomalous orgs that we've previously shown, and looking, have they authenticated, less than or equal to 2 days, which is, 48 hours. And if their distinct organizations authenticated was greater than or equal to 2. And so what we're looking for there is, that's kind of aligned with what we kind of talked about previously, which was, your phishing kit hitting on one anomalous data center, and then within 48 hours, we see the actual operator trying to authenticate from another anomalous data center. And the second approach, this is a little more. This is interesting. This is stuff that I find pretty curious, and is also a pretty good approach to baselining. Is when we see authentications into user management apps from data centers. So in this case, we're kind of looking at a couple different, again, not just like a single necessarily indicator, right? It's we've got a list of assumed or anomalous organizations, data centers, and we've got all these apps that they're trying to authenticate into within 3 hours. Like generally, like that, either one of those in and of itself is not necessarily suspicious or interesting. But if you combine them together, you do kind of see like, all right, so we've got somebody from one of these suspect data centers authenticating to all the user management apps that we've defined. Maybe it's like Microsoft Graph API or some other what have you, from those data centers. And in that case, that would be kind of like two strikes against that particular logon session.
Awesome. And so I think these I like this because I think it we've kind of talked through a little bit of the hypothesis and mechanics, but I think like kind of pulling it up a level, like take us through, I'd say like the principles or kind of like the things that you look for in terms of like quality, context, stuff like that for investigations. Like what do you find most helpful here?
Yeah, it's definitely having context is really helpful in hunting as well as like finding if something is malicious, right? So in this case, we used a lot of the surrounding identity activity. But in general, depending on what you're hunting for, finding out what else is going on around that event that might be suspicious or might be anomalous. So, if you're looking more from endpoint, you might look at process trees, or if you're looking at applications, maybe other application logs along with web traffic. But really having context around what is going on, not just that single event, but being able to see what happened around it helps kind of make that determination. So part of that is really understanding what data you need and, maybe correlating it together. So we looked at, the identity events, so like sign-ins, but also UAL logs, if there's other things going on. And then the baselines also help, right? As you do more hunting or looking into this activity or just get more familiar with your environment or have, some of these built up, you can identify more quickly what's anomalous, right? Like as Tyler was kind of touching on, if you know what VPNs are used in your environment, maybe you don't have an official list, but seeing the ones that aren't commonly used might be something that draws your attention and a little bit more. Or if you know something's definitely not approved software, maybe that's something to kind of look at. Or just if you have those kind of baselines using UEBA, kind of looking at some of that context. As well as Intel. Here we like a lot of Intel. We have a really great Intel team. So having that context around, what are adversaries doing? Is there information that we can leverage and pivot on or incorporate into our hunting to better determine if something might be suspicious or anomalous? I know, Tyler, if you have anything you want to
Yeah,
add.
yeah. I think one area of I'll speak on, I guess, two things. So the first thing is I think I've definitely made this mistake when I've tried to baseline stuff. Is it's unless you have unlimited resources, it's really like a lot more than you have to be a lot more intentional and deliberate from the planning stage than like we're gonna collect all the VPN data. We're gonna see all the VPNs that authenticate, and then we're just gonna stack them. Like that might work. You might be able to get away with that in like something like a VPN. But if you're looking at like process activity, you have to be more deliberate about how you're going to approach that baselining. I know I've done that where it's like I'm going to baseline in Linux every time something reads the etc password file. Like that sounds like a really good idea, except when you actually get that data back, it's a tremendous amount. And so you kind of get into the where's the filter problem is where I've usually describe it as like, where are you going to put your filters in the baselining? And so being deliberate and having good planning around what your end state is from the baseline and then working backwards from there to figure out what data you need to collect to establish that baseline can be really helpful. The second thing I want to talk about was under the intelligence section, we have internal intelligence. I think this is an area that gets overlooked frequently. And there's really, in my mind, a couple components to it. The first is when you have threats or incidents or security events in your environment, we need to have those postmortems, or we need to be able to mine those for information, right? So if you start to see your users getting phished and you have access to what data center they authenticated in, or you have access to what VPNs that you start seeing are associated with phishing, that allows you to build up some like internal intelligence that's probably more directly related to your environment than what you might see from a generic open source list of bad. Second thing is business logic. The application of business logic to your organization when applying baselines cannot be it's like a cheat code. If you can get that information, you can use that to your advantage to help a lot with baselining. An example is, I think if you're looking at like baselining PowerShell activity, and that we're going to look at users that we think have been phished a lot in the past or downloaded malicious things in the past, we'll just pick on like marketing or sales, right? And if we look at, okay, we're going to look at all the salespeople, we have the assumption that no users should be running PowerShell or running encoded commands. We can really target that a little more, and we can sort of weaponize the intelligence we have about how our own business should function to assist with those baselines to kind of lay, I guess, tripwires are probably the best way I could think about it. And then we wait for those to pop.
Yeah, I want to jump in for a second. I know, like, we kind of talked about, and I think we're going to, look at an example here in a second of like a baseline for an identity, which I do think is like uniquely challenging to try to summarize, like, as an analyst, if someone has to try to explain to me Tyler's pattern of life over the course of 6 months, but I only have, 60 seconds or maybe a few minutes to kind of like to internalize or understand that, that's challenging. And like when we wrote Surveyor, right? Like I think, when you're kind of talking through, yeah, not helpful to just see everyone who's read EBC password, but what you do want to try to do is like, you can't look at all of the data from every endpoint, for example, like that's overwhelming, but you also can't just look at one attribute because that's not useful. And so, trying to figure out like how to, I like your kind of concept of filtering, right? Which is like, don't look at it all. Also don't look too narrowly, and like somewhere in between is kind of like the sweet spot in terms of aperture for just like enough additional attributes that you can bucket those things and say, all right, cool. Like this set of things over here is statistically rare. Then you can kind of dig in and figure out from there, like at that point now you're into like an investigation. But yeah, it's like a super thorny problem because when we were prepping for this, I was like, everyone loves to say go baseline activity in your environment, and then everyone overlooks how difficult that can be. But like I think also like the takeaway about intelligence, which is like, everybody here listening has really valuable organizational intelligence, maybe in their head, maybe written down, but it's like, yeah, the thing you learned from every investigation, whether it was a false positive or a true positive, like that's all useful intel. And figuring out how to like codify that and make sure that's not lost is super difficult. So I think we have a couple of questions about that, but I might hold them for the end because some folks were asking questions about like, how to get more mileage out of this stuff and like really how to operationalize threat hunting. So we will come back to that, but I want to give you all an opportunity to just kind of walk through. This is an example of like a user behavioral baseline. And when I mentioned, the challenge in kind of summarizing this stuff, I think this is like a good example of that in the context of this identity investigation.
Yeah, so this contains a lot of good detail, and this is how Red Canary does it, but there's probably other tools or other ways organizations would look at it. But some of the things that are, common for the user, how they typically log in or where they're logging in from, if they usually use VPN, some of this context makes it really easy to find the anomalies if you already know this about a user, right? Like there's, one failed login from Russia that kind of stands out because they're normally signing in from Arizona. So it's kind of a good way of just, for us of understanding what's going on with the user. So if we do see some of those anomalies, we have that additional context to, make a better determination. I don't know, Tyler, if you had anything you wanted to add or if we should jump to the next slide.
I think we can go to the next slide.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is the fun stuff, analyzing the data. So I think like Brittany and I kind of think about baselining as there's two challenges. There's how you collect it and then how do you analyze it. And there's a lot of ways to do both. So what we tried to do here was focus on the analysis piece, and we really broke it down into three different categories, focusing on relevant data, making that data meaningful, and enriching that data with context. And we kind of already hit on a couple of these, so I won't burn through all of them, but like by focusing on the relevant data, like a lot of that is informed by your hypothesis or your bet, whatever you want to phrase that. Not everything can be relevant, and so you have to kind of make some determinations ahead of time as to where your signal might be in the data, and then think about what we're looking for correlation. And then with making data meaningful, again, really you want to try to tailor those to your original hypothesis, and it should be part of your part of your planning before baselining is how you're going to actually analyze it. And then the last piece is enriching that with context. Is we've got we kind of covered this already, but you got your OSINT, your CTI, and then you got your business context. And again, just to reiterate, the business context can be really valuable if you're able to harness some of that. And I think we are at 5 minutes, so I'll pause there.
Yeah, I don't know, Brittany, anything you want to kind of share, your perspective related to this, and then we'll go into questions from there because I think we've got some good ones.
Yeah, so I think to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, we'll just call out one thing, just for the making data meaningful. I know this is kind of vague and probably a challenge a lot of threat hunters have, but it's really going to be kind of dependent on your hypothesis and what you're trying to prove, right? Kind of stacking data is useful, like counts to see what's maybe uncommon. But it also kind of has that, like, how do you stack it the best? Because maybe a user does this thing 1,000 times, but that trend just started happening over the last, day and was related to something else. So then maybe a time chart or, stacking by time and count of events for users. So just kind of keeping in mind your hypothesis and what would actually help you prove or disprove that, and maybe taking different approaches to how you make it meaningful, right? Like you might try and stack the data in multiple ways to get the right level of insight.
So I'm going to ask one question, and then we've got a handful here. So we'll try to get through. I want to try to get through as many of these as we can because we've got some really great ones. But Brittany, you just mentioned, like stacking, grouping, time charts, like short list of tools you use to do that. Like what's your go-to? Again, it's like, like the concepts I think are understandable, but they're also kind of vague. Like how do you do it? Like where do you spend your time?
Yeah, so our team likes to use a lot of Jupyter Notebooks just because it lets you kind of, take that data frame and then stack it in different ways and kind of overlap it. So that's what I like to do, just because then I can see it in multiple ways. I don't know, Tyler, do you have a favorite way of doing it? I think I've been mostly using Jupyter lately.
Yeah, I mean, I usually try not to get too attached to one particular tool. I think there's times where Jupyter and some code can be really helpful, but also if you're a wizard with Excel or Sheets, you can crush it with a CSV file and Microsoft Office, for lack of better. For those of you that are in environments where we can't get, not everybody can access, like Jupyter because permissions or lack of familiarity, you can make a lot of headway with a simple spreadsheet and a CSV file.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to try to burn through some questions. So let's do them rapid fire. All right. First one from Alexis. What's the most impactful thing customer can do to improve the quality of like detections or hunts in their environment?
I think communication is always helpful. Like if we see anomalies and we're not sure if they're like malicious from the threat hunting side, we might reach out to customers and just like let them know, hey, we saw this. Is this something that, you expect? So giving us some of the context that is relevant to their organization that we might not have otherwise, I think is helpful. And then, it's nice to have the data, right? Like we have a lot of integrations. So I'm definitely greedy with data. I don't know about you, Tyler.
Yeah, I think if you're agree with you said, Brittany, and if you're looking like internally to you have like internal sections, I would say be intent. It's again, it's really vague, but like an example is to be intentional and think about the life cycle of the detection. It's not just a set it and forget it, right? Like if I'm making a detection, it's going to be tied to a use case, and that use case might be tied to a specific attack technique, and then we're going to be thoughtful and deliberate about how we implement it. We're going to check, are we catching things? Because I think a lot of times we turn on all these rules and there's no follow-up afterwards, so it gets hard to like filter them out and understand which is actually important, which is producing what. So I think being intentional and thinking about the whole life cycle of a detection rule is really how I would improve the impact and quality.
Awesome. And hey, I know everyone, we're at time. We're going to keep going. So if anyone wants to hang on for a few minutes, like we're just going to burn through some more questions because I think some of these are great. And I am going to give like a quick plug too. So for like, because there were a couple of questions from customers related to like interacting with us about hunts and things like that. And I will say like one of the features we're launching, I think in a week or two, is an ability for folks to give us like organizational intelligence, I guess, for lack of a better term. So telling Red Canary explicitly we will use these 3 authorized VPNs. Hey, like we are a Netscope shop or a Zscaler shop. And so they based, proactively giving our team some of that context so that when Brittany and Tyler and like their compadres are going through and doing these hunts, like they are fed with some of that information up front, which just saves a round trip, right? And so like I think that's useful on the product side for context. So there's another question here related to like this is an interesting one from Garrett. So like it says, and I'm going to try to paraphrase, but it's like I think the concept here is, hey, I keep going in and I've got alerts coming through for third-party VPN usage. I'm marking them as false positives because they are, but I'm worried that at some point that's going to come back to bite me. Effectively, just like, what happens like when you have a whole bunch of legit false positives, but for something like VPNs where we know, like that's a problematic kind of like, entry point. I don't know, like that's a good one. How would you all think through that? Like these types of situations? And I think probably similar to impossible travel, right? I think I know a lot of those our customers tell us are false positives, but like we have to find the needle in the stack of needles.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. So I try to think about these problems in terms of trade-offs and where I am willing to make a bet that like I don't want something. So for example, I'm not saying that I don't know if hopefully we don't have like privileged users being able to authenticate from random VPNs, but say for example, you did have high risk users. Can we tailor that election or that alert a little more to, for low privilege or low risk users, maybe not the CEO, but maybe just, Tyler in sales, right? Are we willing to turn off and eat the potential risk or accept the potential risk of a false positive, or a miss, right? On my VPN usage, but maybe on like the CEO or the chief finance officer or somebody that has a lot more potential blast radius and impact, that's the kind of thing where we might look at like, yeah, I don't care. I want all the alerts for the chief financial officer's VPN usage, because if that is bad, I need to investigate that right away. And so I think that's where, again, where some of your business context comes in. And the second thing I'll say is looking at threats that occur from VPNs and trying to figure out, it's really the correlation. So thinking about when an actor might compromise a VPN credentials, what might the next steps look like from there? And that would perhaps allow you to enrich some of those false positives or false positives in that sense, and so that you're able to target what you're looking at a little more broadly rather than just an atomic VPN.
Got it. That's super helpful. I like that kind of taking, just looking past the actual pathway in and figuring out like what's the next thing and is that next thing normal? And that's a great way to think about that. All right, Brittany, one for you. So so a question from Michael, which is just, do you know of any recommended sources like to help get started baselining activity on specific operating systems? So like this, I'd say like maybe a host hunting question here. I don't know, like what have you found useful for like reading, learning, who's doing interesting work here? Like what you got?
Yeah, so I think it's probably still around, but when I first started in threat hunting, the SANS finding evil was useful. But I think in general, just knowing, what's expected for endpoints and what's not is good. And then also over time, kind of tracking those things. Also, if you have information about your environment that you just, know of, like certain workflows or like maybe, Tyler's example earlier of like PowerShell users, like maybe you just know only developers should be using PowerShell or certain tools. So, kind of having that context and then going and looking across your environment and seeing if that kind of aligns what your hypothesis is and like tracking those things so you can keep building on it to like learn more and incorporate that into future hunts. So I think a lot of it is in general, knowing what's expected for like, certain tools or operating systems, but also taking in that environmental context that and building it up over time and kind of looking at it and tracking it, whether that's like in a ticket or someplace centralized, so your team can also have that context too when it comes to like future hunts or detections.
Cool. And we mentioned it earlier, but I'll give another shameless plug to Surveyor, which is maintained like by this team, by our threat hunting team. And that is like, like probably the best way to do it is to actually just start looking at what's happening in your environment. To your point, like throw that stuff into Excel, even if you don't have like Jupyter Notebooks and stuff handy. So like that is it's a great way to dive right in. All right, last question because it's quick and it's fun. This came in, I think, suspecting right out of the gate when we were prepping. So Tyler, disaster recovery plan for when your coffee grinder stops functioning. What do you do?
Oh, I have multiple coffee grinders. That's the I have like a Baratza, I have a couple of hand grinders, and then if all else fails, I have pre-workout. So I'm gonna get my fix one way or the other. Yeah.
Love it. Brittany, what's your backup?
I'm gonna look terrible because I'm not even as fancy as Tyler, and I buy the K-cups or already ground coffee to make my life easier in the morning.
Yeah, it's we've got the same. It's like we've got a variety of coffee making mechanisms. So I love it. Yeah, Chris said N+1. That's exactly it. It's like just you can never, it's like guitars and coffee grinders, I think, are coffee making devices, I guess. The two things I've learned over the years that you can always convince yourself to buy one more of. That's awesome. Hey, thank you all so much. Folks in the audience, appreciate the questions. Sorry, there were a couple we didn't get to. This was super fun. Tyler, Brittany, really, really appreciate just all your expertise. Like, great job taking us through this today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you. Will we see you next week? I've lost all track of time. Maybe we'll see you next week. Maybe we won't. Have a great day. Cheers.